I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. It's been more than 2 years since the last federal budget, but the Trudeau government is set to unveil a new fiscal blueprint for the country today. The document will detail last year's deficit, estimated to be $380 billion, along with more red ink, with the Liberals already promising between $70 and $100 billion in stimulus spending over the next 3 years. The budget is expected to include measures to boost the supply of affordable housing, funding for a greener economy, and plans for a national childcare system. Well, with military bands and a royal procession, Prince Philip has been laid to rest. His funeral on Saturday honored his lifetime of service to the country, the Crown, and his wife of 73 years, the Queen. Canada also took time to honor his life.
Prince Philip truly dedicated his life's work to the service of others. He was a decorated naval officer, a dedicated philanthropist, a constant in the life of Queen Elizabeth II. And here in Canada, Prince Philip was a patron of the Canadian Armed Forces. He devoted his life to duty and to the people of the Commonwealth. And in the days following his passing, we've heard from countless people across Canada and around the world. They've shared memories, stories, and spoken about his impact on their lives and their communities. This should not come as a surprise to anyone, because Prince Philip was a man of great service.
Prime Minister Trudeau announced Canada would donate $200,000 to the Duke of Edinburgh's International Award, a self-development program available to young people between the ages of 14 and 25. There are now 2,202 people battling COVID-19 in hospitals across Ontario. As high as that figure is, the province says more than 10% of hospitals have not submitted data. 516 of the 755 people in intensive care need mechanical help to breathe. Ottawa is mobilizing resources to send support. Health Minister Patty Hajdu says that the federal government is there for Ontarians and will coordinate and cover the cost of relocating healthcare workers. About 1 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine are scheduled to arrive in Canada this week. Ottawa had planned to take delivery of about 1.2 million doses from Moderna as well, but that was before government officials revealed last week that the shipment would be both delayed and scaled back due to a backlog in quality assurance testing. No deliveries were expected this week from Oxford AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson. Figures released by the Chief Public Health Officer show the average daily number of COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths rose by more than 30% between April 9th and the 15th. The latest national level data found an average of 3,428 infected people were being treated in hospitals each day during the most recent 7-day reporting period. Dr. Teresa Tam says cases, test positivity rates, and intensive care admissions are all rising, driven by more contagious variants. The number of COVID-19 cases per capita in Canada is now higher than the level in the U.S. for the first time since the onset of the pandemic. President Joe Biden recently agreed to lend Canada 1.5 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca shot, and some Americans are suggesting the government should be still more generous with its stockpiles. But others say the Biden administration is right to concentrate on vaccinating U.S. residents first before offering supplies to other countries. Checkpoints are now posted at interprovincial border crossings in Ontario. Premier Doug Ford announced restrictions on traveling between provinces on Friday. He says only those coming into Ontario for work, medical care, transportation of goods, and exercising Indigenous treaty rights will be allowed through the crossings. However, there are no new restrictions on air travel between provinces. Starting Tuesday, residents of Ontario and Alberta aged 40 and older will be able to get the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine. The two provinces announced yesterday that they were lowering the minimum eligibility age. The National Advisory Committee on Immunization has recommended the shot only be offered to those 55 and older due to a slightly elevated risk of an extremely rare blood clot disorder. There have been just 2 cases of blood clots in Canada out of the more than 700,000 doses of AstraZeneca administered so far. Nova Scotia paused for a moment of silence yesterday afternoon as the province mourned the 22 people killed during a 2-day shooting rampage last year. The somber event at First United Church in Truro wasn't open to the public, but was live streamed on social media. Premier Ian Rankin told the congregation that it was important for those experiencing great loss to come together and seek strength from their community. All right, stay with us. This past week, the new federal budget was announced, and we took a look at the biggest line items and what they mean for Canadians. An interview with Mr. Elliott Hughes, Senior Advisor at Summa Strategies, coming up next in our Week in Review. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. The federal government unveiled its long-awaited 2021 budget yesterday, following up on key campaign promises while charting a path towards a post-pandemic Canada. The budget comes with a spending promise of more than $100 billion over the next 3 years amid record-smashing deficits. Canada's debt is now over $1 trillion for the first time ever after a $354 billion deficit for the pandemic year just over, and an expected deficit of $155 billion for fiscal 2021-22. To help break down the key points of yesterday's budget, we are joined by Mr. Elliott Hughes, Senior Advisor at Summa Strategies. Welcome back to Forum Daily, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Now, there was a lot covered yesterday in the budget announcement, but what would you say are some of the big ticket items from yesterday's budget?
This was a landmark budget, whether we like to admit it or not. When we look back in a few years' time, the two big things that I think will stick out will be the spending, so the scale of the spending and the scale of the deficits, and the ambition of the budget. So you had childcare front and center, $30 billion over 5 years with $8 billion sort of from then on. And then the commitments around the green economy and investing in clean tech, the jobs of the future, so to speak. So those, to me, would be the two big pieces when we look back at, we make our way through this huge amount of spending and lots of red ink. But those two items particularly will make this a landmark budget.
Now, talking about this child care benefit, women were highlighted as a demographic that was hit harder by the pandemic. A lot of them had to quit their jobs to take care of their children. So let's talk a little bit about the Liberals' plan to help this particular demographic. So the child care plan sounded expansive, but is it enough to help bring women back into the workforce right after this pandemic?
Great question. Lots of details still to be ironed out with the early learning and child care plan. It's a national plan. As I said, $30 billion over 5 years, so considerable amount of investment from the government. But it still requires negotiations with provinces. What's interesting here is they're going to be one-to-one negotiations. So the federal government picking off individual provinces one by one, rather than trying to negotiate with all of them at once. So that will be interesting to see how the federal government plays each province off against one another. So a lot of commitment around the child care piece. And certainly, there's been a disproportionate impact on women by this pandemic, and that's clearly been coming through in the numbers. And a lot of the efforts, including the childcare piece, but also lots of support for SMEs and rehiring, were targeted towards bringing women who have been particularly hard hit and the ones let go by some of the hardest hit sectors back into employment. So we'll see how it goes. Some short-term effort and some more medium and long-term effort as well.
Now, I really want to touch on what opposition leaders are saying about this budget. We know Conservative leader Erin O'Toole, he's saying that the budget is lacking a clear plan to secure the economy. Can you tell us a little bit more on this argument?
Well, Erin O'Toole's, I think, in a bit of a tight spot. I think, there is a fair point to make that there is a lot of spending in this, and the return to balance is a ways away. The problem is that Erin O'Toole has also not committed to balancing the budget for the next decade or so. So I think he finds himself in a little bit of a difficult position in that Canadians are willing and I think want the government to be spending in this time, particularly with the impact that the pandemic has had. And so, his criticisms may actually fall on deaf ears. That's challenging ahead of a potential fall election, and his back to equal deficits or no deficits is not something that I think is going to render him with a lot of votes come election day.
Now, considering that Canadian taxpayers will be funding these budget initiatives, Jagmeet Singh, he's saying that the budget does not target ultra-rich Canadians for taxes to pay for budget initiatives. So do you think this is a good move to consider right now?
I think that the discussion around wealth taxation or increased GST or whatever conversation there is to be had around taxation will likely take place whenever that next election takes place. This budget was about focusing on getting the job done on COVID, so lots of investment there. Some big ticket items like childcare and green technology, but a lot of the revenue raising discussion hasn't been touched on yet, and that's something that I'm sure will feature very prominently in the debate around the next federal election. On the one hand, Jagmeet Singh asking for wealthier Canadians to pay, and Erin O'Toole likely calling for a reduction in taxes. So again, that taxation debate will, I'm sure, be very live come a couple months from now.
All right. Well, this conversation keeps on going, Mr. Hughes. We'll be sure to bring you right back on the show to talk more on this. But thank you again for your time today, sir.
Thank you so much.
This past week, we spoke with Brendan Caldwell, director of Caldwell Securities Limited, about the future of the Canadian housing market. More on this coming up. The Canadian housing market is a hot topic at the moment, both in terms of housing prices and in policy discussions. While many Canadians view home ownership as one of their most important investments, there are concerns that changes to our system may impact our national prosperity and hurt people, especially young Canadians trying to get into the market. Here to speak more on the matter is Brendan Caldwell, director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Welcome to Forum Daily, Brendan.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you recently put out a full-page ad on both the National Post and the Globe and Mail. This ad was called, "There is no place like home. Taxing homes is taxing our future." So can you tell us a little bit about this ad and why you invested in this ad?
Well, with the upcoming budget, or at least upcoming as of last week, for the federal budget, we had felt that there was a danger because of the talk in the media about the potential for taxing the capital gains on people's homes, people's principal residence. And we were worried that because of the vast amount of money that's been spent to pay for the pandemic and other programs, that the federal government would be looking for money wherever it could. And since people had these very big gains on their own homes, we thought, well, that'll be a sure place that they're going to want to look. So we wanted to have a bit of a preemptive strike.
So in this ad, you were saying that the current system in Canada actually encourages home ownership, and this in turn increases national prosperity. So now you're voicing a little bit of a concern about a recent trend towards higher taxation impacting the middle and working class, along with young Canadians. Can you tell us a little bit more about these concerns and why we should consider these concerns as well, sir?
Well, the Canadian system is just different than the rest of the world. We don't at present tax the capital gains on people's main homes, their principal residences. And that's odd, that's weird. But Canada is an odd country. We think curling's an actual sport, but we do things differently, and that's kind of what makes us different. So that can be a really good thing. Like we saw in the 2008 financial crisis, which began as a worldwide housing bubble that went pop, particularly in the United States, because other countries do their systems better. Other countries do their systems differently than us. I think Canada does it better because Canadians are more likely to pay off their mortgage. They're more likely to have an incentive to pay down their debt. If we change the system so that someone's home is just like any other investment, there's going to be greater leverage. And in the event of an economic downturn, you'll see more people lose their houses. That's what happened in the US and most of the rest of the world, where in Canada, during the financial crisis, it was almost a non-event here. So that's our concern in terms of housing bubbles. I think it will make it worse. But for younger people and for people that are on their way, it does, being able to keep the capital gains on your home allows you to continue to trade up as your financial resources grow, as your families grow. It allows you to buy nicer homes, the kind of homes maybe that your parents had and that you grew up in. And I would not hate to see the younger generation deprived of that opportunity.
Now, as you mentioned, the federal budget was announced this week, and this ad was put out before the budget announcement. What has been your reaction to the budget's potential impact to Canada's housing market?
Very, very tiny, thin end of the wedge was just slipped in there as regards to housing. It was that the houses of foreigners or people outside of Canada, whatever term you want to use, that are sitting vacant they will be subject to some sort of tax. Thin end of the wedge, and it says, well, they're not, living in it. It's not fair. It's this or that. But it's just a little thing to show that maybe the taxing of houses might be on the table. Realistically, it would be a very hard sell for a minority government to tax the homes of, 70% of Canadians own their own homes, more than the U.S., more than virtually any other developed country on earth. So I thought for a minority government, it would be very hard to do. But I wonder to what extent this tax on foreign ownership of homes that are left vacant would be the thin end of the wedge to taxing something larger in this way.
All right, Brendan, we've got about 45 seconds left, but if you could give younger Canadians just one piece of realistic and actionable advice in terms of getting into the housing market, what would it be?
Well, I know the condo market is very hot. It's very hot here in Toronto and elsewhere, but there is an unlimited amount of sky. There's a limited amount of earth. In the law of supply and demand, earth will beat sky every time. So if you are able to get something on the ground, an actual house, longer term, I think that's going to leave you in better stead than a shelf in the sky. But first and foremost, where you live is a lifestyle. Decide how you want to live, and then the finances will look after themselves.
All right, Brendan, great having you on Forum Daily today, sir, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
After the break, a look at what made international headlines this past week. Stay with us, more to come. The U.S. feds are taking a good long look at ransomware and those who use it to extort people, businesses, and governments. The probe is being done by the Justice Department after a year that was the costliest on record for such cyber attacks. One step being taken is the formation of a task force of FBI agents and federal prosecutors to slow the spread of online extortion. Ransomware attacks are those in which hackers seize and lock up computer data and then demand ransom payments from the owners to get it back. Australia has pulled the plug on 4 bilateral deals with China, Iran, and Syria after new laws that give the federal government power to overrule international agreements by lower-level administrations deemed to violate the national interest. The country's foreign minister says the cancelled deals include Victoria's 2 Belt and Road Infrastructure Building Initiative deals with Beijing that were signed in 2018 and 2019. Those deals triggered the legislative response. China earlier warned against disrupting such successful pragmatic cooperation. New Zealand says it will continue to have a close and productive relationship with the U.S. and other security allies, despite resisting speaking out in unison with them against China on certain human rights issues. New Zealand Foreign Minister Nania Mahuta discussed her reluctance to expand the role of the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Alliance to include stances on human rights. The alliance between New Zealand and the U.S., the U.K., Australia, and Canada dates to World War II. Chad's political opposition is calling the handing of power to Mahamat Idris Deby a coup d'etat. The mounting opposition to Chad's transitional government came as the international community also pressed for a quick return to democracy after the killing of longtime President Idris Deby Itno. It was announced that his 37-year-old son would serve as the head of an 18-month-long transitional government. Indonesia's Navy ships are intensely searching for a submarine that likely fell too deep to retrieve, making survival chances for the 53 people on board slim. The Navy chief says oxygen in the submarine would run out by 3 a.m. on Saturday. He says rescuers found an unidentified object with high magnetism in the area and that officials hope that it is the submarine. An oil slick and the smell of diesel fuel were reported near its last dive north of the resort island of Bali. A Syrian anti-aircraft missile has landed in southern Israel, setting off air raid sirens near the country's top-secret nuclear reactor. In response, Israeli officials say the country's military struck back, targeting the missile launcher and air defense systems in Syria. Israeli media later described the Syrian missile as an errant projectile, not a deliberate attack. A Hong Kong journalist has been found guilty of making false statements and obtaining information for an investigation into an attack on anti-government protesters in the latest blow to press freedom in the city. Choi Yuk-ling was arrested in November on charges of falsely declaring why she was obtaining license plate information from a publicly accessible database. The online application requires reason for obtaining vehicle ownership records and doesn't provide an option for journalistic research. Ms. Choi was convicted of 2 counts and fined $775. The world's fastest pace of spreading infections and the highest daily increase in coronavirus cases are pushing India further into a deepening and deadly healthcare crisis. India is the world's second most populous country, and its size presents extraordinary challenges to fighting COVID-19. It is a major vaccine producer, but making enough to protect people will take time. Some 2.7 million vaccine doses are given daily, but that is still less than 10% of its people who have gotten their first shot. Switzerland's Financial Markets Authority says it is looking into possible penalties against Credit Suisse after the top bank announced significant losses linked to an American-based hedge fund. The authority says it will require various risk-reducing measures and probe possible shortcomings in risk management at Credit Suisse. 2 weeks ago, the bank announced it was taking a $4.4 billion Swiss franc charge, about $4.7 billion US, linked to a default on margin calls by US-based Archegos Capital. And on Earth Day, a story from Germany. The country may be known for its Autobahn and motor industry, but the government has a new plan to make Germany a bicycle country. Germany aims to boost bike use and safety by 2030, with a goal of increasing the average number of bike journeys each German makes by 50%. Officials say compared to driving, that would result in greenhouse gas emission savings equivalent to 3 to 4 million tons of carbon dioxide. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and be sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for updates. Thanks for joining us on the Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again next time.